The emergency alarm in the Al-Zahra Hospital ICU pierced the 3 a.m. silence on March 27, 2021, sending nurses sprinting toward room 14 where Dr. Ahmed Khalil, a 42-year-old cardiac surgeon, lay convulsing on a hospital bed meant for patients, not physicians. Medication vials littered the floor around him. An empty syringe dangled from the foreport in his arm. Security footage would later show that only one person had entered his room during the fatal hour, the night shift ICU nurse he had trusted with his secrets, his lies, and ultimately, his life. Standing at the nursing station with trembling hands and a belly barely concealing 6 months of pregnancy, was Katerina Santos. Her eyes held something beyond fear, a desperate clarity that comes from making irreversible choices. She had been the perfect nurse for 3 years. Never late, never complained, never questioned authority. But perfection has a breaking point, especially when you're carrying the child of a married doctor who has just informed you that your pregnancy is a problem he intends to solve permanently. What happened in room 14 wasn't a momentary loss of control. It was the culmination of 18 months of manipulation, broken promises, and a secret that had grown too large to hide. This isn't just about an affair gone wrong. This is about power dynamics in hospitals where doctors are gods and foreign nurses are expendable. It's about a woman who healed others while destroying herself. And it's about the moment when desperation transforms caring hands into instruments of death. Stay with us because the question isn't just whether Katarina killed Dr. Khalil. The question is whether the woman who administered that fatal injection was a murderer or the last victim of a predator who wore a white coat instead of a mask. Katerina Rose Santos was born on December 3, 1994, in Bacolod City, Philippines, the sugar capital of the nation, where vast plantations created wealth for landowners, while workers' children grew up watching cane fires illuminate night skies with promises that never reached their homes. Her family lived in a wooden house on stilts in Barangay Mansilingan, where flooding during typhoon season turned streets into rivers and poverty into an inescapable reality that shaped every decision. Her father, Rodrigo, worked as a driver for one of the sugar plantation families, earning 8,000 pesos monthly, roughly $160 US, for 6-day weeks that started before dawn and ended after dark. Her mother, Luz, supplemented their income by selling bibingka and puto at the public market, her hands perpetually sticky with coconut and her back aching from hours bent over steaming pots. They had 5 children, and Katarina, as the eldest daughter, carried responsibilities that stole her childhood and replaced it with adult burdens before she turned 12. She was different from her siblings in ways that became evident early. While they accepted their circumstances with the resignation of those who couldn't imagine alternatives, Katarina studied with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She read by candlelight during power outages, memorized textbooks she couldn't afford to keep, and walked 90 minutes each way to a public high school that offered science programs unavailable in their neighborhood. Her dream of becoming a nurse wasn't born from some noble calling to serve humanity. It was pure economics and calculated survival. Nursing offered the clearest pathway out of poverty for Filipino women. Jobs that paid real salaries, opportunities to work abroad where monthly earnings could exceed what her father made in a year, and most crucially, the ability to lift entire families out of the poverty cycle through overseas remittances. At 16, she watched her best friend's sister return from Dubai on vacation, carrying an iPhone that cost more than 6 months of Rodrigo's salary and wearing clothes that announced transformation from provincial girl to modern overseas Filipino worker. That sister had been a nurse for just 2 years in Dubai, and she had already sent enough money home to rebuild her family's house with concrete walls and a real roof, to put her younger siblings through private school, and to purchase a small sari-sari store that generated additional income. Dubai changes everything, the sister told Katarina during a conversation that would shape the next decade of her life. You work hard, you save money, you send it home, and suddenly your family has a future. The doctors there treat Filipino nurses well. You're respected. Not like here where we're just workers. That conversation planted seeds that would eventually grow into both salvation and destruction. Katarina began researching nursing programs with scholarship opportunities, calculating exactly how many years of sacrifice would be required to transform herself from a plantation driver's daughter into someone whose life had value beyond survival. In 2012, At 18 years old, Katerina was accepted into West Negroes University's nursing program on a partial scholarship that covered tuition but nothing else. She worked 3 jobs simultaneously to cover her living expenses: tutoring elementary students before classes, serving at a coffee shop during afternoons, and doing data entry remotely for a virtual assistant company until 2 a.m. most nights. She slept 4 hours daily for 4 years straight, her body running on coffee, determination, and the knowledge that failure meant returning to a life she had spent 18 years trying to escape. Her academic performance was exemplary not because nursing came naturally to her, but because she couldn't afford any outcome except excellence. She graduated second in her class in 2016, passing the nursing board exam on her first attempt with scores high enough to attract attention from international recruitment agencies that specialized in placing Filipino nurses in Gulf countries. The recruitment process for Dubai positions was rigorous and expensive. Medical exams, credential verification, HAAD licensing preparation, English proficiency tests, and agency processing fees totaled nearly 150,000 pesos, roughly $3,000 US dollars, more than her father earned in 18 months. Her family borrowed from relatives, took loans from informal lenders charging predatory interest rates, and sold a small parcel of land Luz had inherited from her mother. This debt wasn't just financial. It was emotional and moral, a burden that transformed Katerina's Dubai opportunity from personal achievement into family obligation. She wasn't just working for herself anymore. She was carrying the hopes, sacrifices, and financial survival of 7 people whose futures depended on her success in a country she had never visited, working in hospitals where one mistake could destroy everything her family had invested. On September 15, 2017, 22-year-old Katerina Santos boarded a flight to Dubai with a single suitcase containing everything she owned, a heart pounding with equal parts excitement and terror, and absolutely no idea that the healing hands she had trained for 4 years would eventually be used to end a life rather than save one. Dr. Ahmed Khalil was born into the kind of privilege that makes ambition effortless and empathy optional. Born in 1979 in Abu Dhabi to a family whose construction empire had turned desert sand into billion-dollar developments, Ahmed never experienced the desperation that shaped people like Katerina. His childhood home in Al Khalidia was a villa where marble floors stayed cool even in August heat, and where housekeepers ensured he never had to consider the basic labor that sustained his comfort. His path to cardiac surgery was paved with advantages that he mistook for personal merit. Private international schools where class sizes were small and expectations high, a medical degree from Imperial College London funded without loans or financial stress, and surgical residency positions secured partly through his father's hospital investments rather than solely through his undeniable but not exceptional competence. By 2017, at 38, Ahmed had established himself as a respected cardiac surgeon at Al Zahra Hospital, one of Dubai's premier private medical facilities. His surgical skills were genuine and his patient outcomes were good, but his reputation among nursing staff told a different story. He was charming with patients, collegial with fellow physicians, and subtly demeaning toward nurses, particularly the foreign contract nurses from Philippines, India, and Eastern Europe who formed the backbone of Dubai's medical workforce. His marriage to Layla, a Syrian woman from an established Damascus family who had relocated to Dubai during Syria's civil conflict, appeared stable from outside observation. They had 2 children, a daughter, Yasmin, aged 7, and a son, Omar, aged 4. They lived in a Palm Jumeirah villa, drove luxury vehicles, and maintained the kind of perfect Instagram presence that suggested happiness while revealing nothing about the emotional emptiness underneath. But Ahmed's relationship with Fidelity was casual at best. His affairs followed predictable patterns. Identify vulnerable women in subordinate positions, offer attention and affection that contrasted sharply with their lonely circumstances, make promises calibrated to maintain access without providing commitment, and discard them when complications arose or when newer opportunities appeared more exciting. Previous affairs had included a physiotherapist from Ukraine who had eventually returned home when her contract ended, a pharmaceutical sales representative who had transferred to another emirate after their relationship became known to colleagues, and at least 2 other nurses whose departures from Al Zahra Hospital were officially documented as personal reasons but were actually negotiated exits facilitated by hospital HR to avoid scandal. Ahmed's psychology combined narcissistic entitlement with genuine charm. He believed that his attention was valuable, that being chosen by a successful, attractive surgeon should feel like privilege rather than exploitation to the women he pursued. He rationalized his affairs as harmless because he never intended to leave his marriage, viewing his extramarital relationships as separate from his real life with Layla and their children. His interest in nurses was partly practical and partly predatory. Practical because their shift patterns created opportunities for encounters that didn't require elaborate explanations, and predatory because their visa status, sponsored by the hospital and revocable upon employment termination, created power imbalances that made resistance difficult and complaints professionally suicidal. Ahmed's charm was sophisticated enough to make his targets feel special rather than exploited, at least initially. He remembered personal details, asked about families back home, offered assistance with visa paperwork or financial loans during emergencies. This pattern of kindness created gratitude and obligation that he later leveraged into intimacy, transforming professional relationships into personal ones through incremental boundary violations that felt natural rather than calculated. By the time his targets recognized the manipulation, they were typically already emotionally invested and professionally vulnerable. Ending the relationship meant potentially losing their jobs, their visa status, and the income their families depended on. Ahmed understood this dynamic perfectly and exploited it without apparent conscience or concern for the devastation he left behind. His colleagues either didn't know about his pattern or chose not to know, a willful ignorance that protected the hospital's reputation and their own comfortable relationships with a skilled surgeon whose personal life seemed irrelevant to his professional competence. The few nurses who had quietly complained to hospital administration found their concerns minimized as cultural misunderstandings or personal relationship issues that weren't the hospital's responsibility to adjudicate. This was the man Katerina Santos encountered in October 2019 when she was assigned to the cardiac ICU where Dr. Khalil performed most of his surgeries. She saw his charm, his competence, his apparent kindness to staff. What she couldn't see was the pattern that had destroyed other women before her, or that she was already being evaluated as his next target from the moment she introduced herself during his first post-operative patient rounds. Katarina's first 2 years at Al-Zahra Hospital had been defined by careful professionalism and strategic invisibility. She worked night shifts in the general ICU, sent 70% of her 12,000 dirham monthly salary home to her family, and lived in shared accommodation in Dera with 3 other Filipino nurses who became her surrogate family in a city that felt both exciting and alienating. Her transfer to the cardiac ICU in October 2019 represented professional advancement, better shifts, more specialized experience, and proximity to complex cases that would enhance her credentials for future opportunities. It also placed her directly in Dr. Khalil's orbit during her most vulnerable period. Her vulnerability wasn't obvious to casual observers. She appeared confident and competent, her English fluent and her clinical skills solid. But internally, she was struggling with the isolation that plagues many overseas workers, the homesickness that video calls can't cure, the cultural alienation that comes from living between two worlds, and the crushing responsibility of supporting 7 people on a salary that felt simultaneously generous and insufficient. Her younger sister, Maria, had been diagnosed with stage 2 breast cancer in August 2019. The treatment costs, chemotherapy, radiation, medications, exceeded what their father's salary and mother's market stall could possibly cover. Katarina's monthly remittances had shifted from supporting general family expenses to funding medical care that would either save her sister's life or bankrupt the family trying. This was her psychological state when Dr. Khalil first showed her the kind of attention that felt less like workplace courtesy and more like personal interest. It started with small things during November 2019, compliments on her clinical assessments that went beyond standard acknowledgement, questions about her well-being that seemed genuinely curious rather than perfunctory, offers to review complex cases with her privately to enhance her learning. The shift from professional to personal happened gradually enough that Katerina couldn't identify a specific moment when boundaries were crossed. In December, Ahmed began timing his breaks to coincide with hers, joining her in the hospital cafeteria where their conversations expanded beyond medicine to include personal histories, family challenges, and the loneliness they both claimed to experience in different ways. Ahmed's approach was sophisticated. He shared his own vulnerabilities or performed them convincingly, talking about the pressure of living up to his family's expectations, the emotional distance in his marriage that he portrayed as mutual and amicable, and his admiration for nurses like Katerina who sacrificed so much for their families. He made her feel seen in ways that her life in Dubai had not previously provided. By January 2020, their interactions had become clearly flirtatious. Ahmed brought her coffee prepared exactly how she liked it, remembered details from previous conversations that proved he was paying attention, and began sending text messages during his off hours, initially about hospital matters, but gradually more personal and intimate. Katerina's resistance to this escalation was real but inconsistent. She recognized the danger of becoming involved with a married doctor, understood the power imbalance that made any relationship inherently problematic, and knew that previous nurses had been harmed by similar situations. But she was also desperately lonely, financially stressed about her sister's cancer treatment, and starved for the kind of attention Ahmed was providing. The physical relationship began in late January 2020 in a call room during a night shift when the ICU was unusually quiet. Ahmed had checked on a post-operative patient, found Katerina charting at the nursing station, and suggested she take a break since the unit was stable. What happened next wasn't forced or violent. It was the culmination of 2 months of emotional manipulation that had prepared Katerina to accept his advances despite every rational alarm in her head telling her to refuse. Their affair continued through the early months of 2020, conducted in the shadows of the hospital's call rooms, his car in the parking structure, and occasionally at a hotel apartment he rented in Business Bay under a corporate account that couldn't be traced to personal use. Ahmed was careful to avoid patterns that might expose them, varying locations and timing, never appearing together in public, maintaining perfect professionalism during work hours. For Katerina, the relationship felt simultaneously thrilling and shameful. Ahmed's attention made her feel valued in ways her exhausting work and family obligations never did. He provided not just emotional intimacy but also financial support, helping cover her sister's medical expenses with loans he insisted she needn't repay immediately, assistance that created gratitude and deeper obligation that tightened his control even as it solved her immediate crisis. But by March 2020, Katerina began noticing patterns that triggered alarm. Ahmed's promises about eventually leaving his marriage were always vague and future tense, contingent on circumstances that never quite materialized. His availability was entirely dictated by his schedule and needs, never considering hers. And most disturbingly, she overheard other nurses discussing a previous affair he had denied when she had explicitly asked if he had history with staff. The confrontation in April 2020 was Katerina's first attempt to establish boundaries or end the relationship. She told Ahmed she felt uncomfortable continuing an affair with a married man, that the secrecy was destroying her sense of integrity, and that she needed to focus on her work and family obligations rather than a relationship with no legitimate future. Ahmed's response revealed his mastery of manipulation. He didn't argue or pressure. Instead, he expressed deep sadness, validated her concerns, and suggested they maintain distance while he worked on resolving his marriage situation properly. The implication was clear. He was seriously considering divorce, and she just needed to be patient while he navigated the complex personal and family dynamics involved. This response was perfectly calibrated to keep her emotionally invested without requiring any actual change from him. Katerina's guilt about potentially breaking up his marriage was alleviated by the suggestion that it was already broken. Her concerns about their future were addressed with vague promises that felt sincere because Ahmed delivered them with apparent emotional authenticity. They resumed their physical relationship within 2 weeks, and by June 2020, Katerina had fully surrendered to a situation she couldn't control or escape. She told herself she loved him, that their connection was genuine despite the circumstances, that eventually he would fulfill his promises about being together properly. In August 2020, Katerina's period was 3 weeks late. The pregnancy test she took in a hospital bathroom during her shift displayed 2 pink lines that would change everything and set in motion the events that would end with Dr. Khalil dead on an ICU bed and Katerina Santos facing murder charges that would destroy any future she had imagined. Katerina stared at the pregnancy test for 17 minutes in that locked hospital bathroom, her mind cycling through scenarios that ranged from impossible to catastrophic. At 25 years old, pregnant by a married doctor in a country where extramarital pregnancy could result in deportation and prosecution, she understood that every option available to her was devastating. Her first instinct was termination, not because she opposed abortion morally, but because it seemed like the only way to contain a situation that threatened to destroy everything she had built and everyone who depended on her. But abortion was illegal in the UAE except in cases of severe fetal abnormality or maternal health risk. The underground options available through certain clinics came with risks of complications, prosecution, and costs that exceeded her available funds. She told Ahmed about the pregnancy on August 15, 2020, during a conversation in his car in a remote parking area near Dubai Investment Park. His initial reaction was shock that quickly transformed into something calculating and cold. He asked immediately if she was certain he was the father, a question that wounded her deeply since he was her only sexual partner, ever. His next questions revealed his priorities clearly. How far along was she? Had she told anyone? What were her plans for handling it? The clinical detachment in his voice, the same tone he used discussing patient cases, made clear that this wasn't a shared crisis but rather a problem he expected her to solve with minimal impact on his life. Katerina, still hoping for some indication that he cared about her beyond their affair, asked tentatively about the possibility of having the child. She wasn't proposing marriage or even acknowledgement, just the possibility that maybe they could find a way to navigate the situation that didn't require ending the pregnancy. Ahmed's response was immediate and absolute. That was impossible. His marriage, his family, his reputation, his career, none of it could survive an illegitimate child with a Filipino nurse. He would help her financially to obtain a termination, either through underground clinics in Dubai or by traveling to a country where abortion was legal and could be obtained safely. But carrying the pregnancy to term was not an option he would entertain or support. The conversation lasted 90 minutes and ended with Ahmed providing 15,000 dirhams in cash and the contact information for a clinic in Sharjah that apparently performed quiet terminations for the right price. He told her to handle it quickly before the pregnancy became too advanced, and he promised they could continue their relationship once the situation was resolved. Katerina scheduled an appointment at the Sharjah clinic for August 22nd. She went alone, told no one, and sat in the waiting room for 45 minutes before walking out without going through with the procedure. She couldn't articulate exactly why she couldn't proceed. Some combination of moral conflict, physical fear, and emotional rebellion against Ahmed's assumption that her compliance was guaranteed. Her decision to continue the pregnancy wasn't carefully considered or rational. It was instinctive and desperate, born from a place of anger that Ahmed could create this situation and then demand she fix it alone while he returned to his perfect family life as if nothing had happened. September and October 2020 brought the physical reality of pregnancy that Katerina struggled to hide. Morning sickness forced her to call in sick to shifts, something she had never done in 3 years of employment. Her scrubs began fitting differently around her abdomen, requiring larger sizes and careful layering to disguise the changes. Most dangerously, her emotional state became increasingly unstable as hormones combined with stress produced mood swings and crying episodes that concerned her roommates. Ahmed's response to her continued pregnancy was a mixture of anger, threats, and pressure. He accused her of trying to trap him, of being irresponsible and selfish, of deliberately sabotaging both their futures. He stopped providing the financial assistance he had previously offered for her sister's medical care. He withdrew the emotional warmth that had made their affair feel like more than just sex. And most chillingly, he began making vague references to having connections who could help resolve problems that people were unwilling to resolve themselves. Katerina interpreted these statements as threats but couldn't determine if Ahmed was suggesting he would arrange for forced termination, deportation, or simply making her life at the hospital untenable until she quit and left the country. The ambiguity was itself a form of psychological torture that left her terrified and sleepless. By November 2020, at 4 months pregnant, Katerina could no longer hide her condition from her roommates. She confided in 2 of them, both Filipino nurses who responded with a mixture of sympathy and alarm. They urged her to contact the Philippine consulate, to seek legal advice, to do anything except continue hiding a situation that was approaching the point where all options would disappear. One of her roommates, An older nurse named Betty, who had worked in Dubai for 12 years, shared the story of another Filipino nurse who had faced similar circumstances. That nurse had eventually been deported after her pregnancy became known to hospital administration. She had returned to the Philippines in shame, unable to support her family, with a child fathered by a doctor who denied everything and faced no consequences. "These men," Betty said with weary anger, "they take what they want and we pay the price. Every time. You think you're special, that your situation is different, but it's always the same story." December 2020 brought Katerina's breaking point. At 5 months pregnant, her condition was becoming impossible to hide. She made the decision that would ultimately save and destroy her. She confronted Ahmed with an ultimatum. He would either acknowledge paternity and provide financial support for the child, or she would report their relationship to hospital administration and his wife. Ahmed's response to this threat was initially dismissive. He reminded her that she had no proof of paternity, that their relationship could be denied, that her word as a foreign contract nurse would carry less weight than his as an established physician from a prominent family. He suggested that threatening him was unwise given her precarious legal position as a pregnant unmarried woman in the UAE. But Katerina had anticipated this response. She had been documenting their relationship for months, saving text messages, recording some of their conversations without his knowledge, photographing evidence of their encounters. She showed Ahmed enough of this documentation to prove that denial would be difficult, and that exposure would be professionally and personally catastrophic for him even if he eventually escaped legal consequences. The photographs and messages wouldn't prove rape or coercion, but they would prove an affair between a senior doctor and a subordinate nurse, creating grounds for hospital disciplinary action and family destruction that Ahmed couldn't afford. His reputation, his marriage, his position, all of it was vulnerable to the evidence Katerina had carefully accumulated. Ahmed's demeanor changed completely when confronted with actual evidence rather than empty threats. The charm and manipulation were replaced by barely controlled rage. He accused her of planning this from the beginning, of being a gold digger who had seduced him deliberately to create this situation. The psychological projection was stunning. He rewrote their entire relationship's history to cast himself as victim and her as predator. Their final argument occurred on March 24, 2021, in his car in the hospital parking structure at 11 p.m. Katerina, now 6 months pregnant and unable to work floor shifts safely, had been moved to administrative duties that kept her employed but made her feel increasingly isolated and vulnerable. She had received notice that her visa was under review due to her pregnancy status, which meant hospital administration had discovered her condition and was initiating termination procedures. Ahmed admitted during this conversation that he had informed hospital HR about her pregnancy, framing it as concern for patient safety rather than revenge for her blackmail threats. He told her the hospital would terminate her employment within 2 weeks, and that her visa would be revoked shortly after. She would be deported back to the Philippines, where she could have the baby in poverty while he continued his comfortable life untouched by consequences. "You're not the first nurse who thought she could trap me," he said with chilling calmness. "And you won't be the last. The system protects people like me. That's just reality." The devastation of that moment was total. Katerina would lose her job, her visa, her ability to support her family. Her sister's cancer treatment would end because the money would stop. She would return home pregnant and unemployed, carrying proof of her shame and failure. And Ahmed, the man who had created this situation through deliberate manipulation and exploitation, would face absolutely no consequences. Something broke in Katerina during that conversation. Not her mind exactly, but something fundamental about her belief that justice or fairness had any place in the world she inhabited. She had followed the rules her entire life, worked hard, sacrificed constantly, behaved ethically even when others didn't. And the result was complete destruction while her abuser walked away unscathed. The plan that formed in her mind over the next 72 hours wasn't born from sudden rage or temporary insanity. It was calculated and desperate, formed by someone who had realized that the only justice she would receive was the justice she created herself. On March 27, 2021, Katerina Santos went to work for what would be the last time, carrying medications she had carefully acquired over several weeks and a determination to ensure that Ahmed Khalil would not escape accountability for destroying her life. March 27, 2021, began as an unremarkable Saturday in the Al-Zahra Hospital ICU. Katerina arrived for her 7 p.m. shift wearing scrubs that barely concealed her 6-month pregnancy and carrying the emotional exhaustion of someone who had spent 3 nights without sleep, planning actions she had never imagined herself capable of executing. Her plan was simple and utilized her intimate knowledge of hospital protocols, medication access, and Ahmed's predictable patterns. She knew he would be in the hospital late that night. He had mentioned during their last conversation that he was performing an emergency CABG surgery scheduled for 9 p.m., and these procedures typically meant he would remain on site for several hours post-operatively to monitor his patient. The medications Katerina had acquired over the previous month came from the pharmacy storage where her nursing credentials provided legitimate access. She had taken small quantities of potassium chloride, insulin, and a paralytic agent used in anesthesia, amounts small enough to avoid triggering automatic inventory alerts, gathered gradually over multiple shifts by multiple nurses. She had quietly asked for access during emergencies or busy periods when proper documentation was overlooked. Each medication alone could be explained as clinical need. Together, in the dosages she planned, they would create a lethal cocktail that could mimic cardiac arrest or metabolic crisis. Plausible medical emergencies for a cardiac surgeon who worked punishing hours under constant stress. At 2:30 a.m., Katerina saw Ahmed at the ICU nursing station, reviewing charts for his post-operative patient in room 12. He looked exhausted, his surgical scrubs wrinkled and his eyes red from the 7-hour procedure he had just completed. He barely acknowledged Katerina's presence, just a curt nod that reminded her of how completely she had been erased from his concern or conscience. She approached him with calculated normalcy, asking professional questions about his patient's post-operative orders. Ahmed responded with clinical details, never meeting her eyes, treating her with the impersonal courtesy he would show any nurse whose name he couldn't quite remember. "You should rest," Katerina said softly. "You look exhausted. Room 14 is empty if you want to lie down for an hour. I'll monitor your patient and alert you if anything changes." Her suggestion was reasonable and followed informal hospital culture, where surgeons often used empty patient rooms for brief rest periods during overnight shifts. Ahmed accepted without hesitation, grateful for the offer and completely unsuspecting of the nurse he had betrayed and threatened. He settled into the bed in room 14 at 2:47 a.m., and Katerina watched through the glass partition as he closed his eyes. She waited 20 minutes until she was certain he had fallen into exhausted sleep. Then she prepared the syringes with hands that trembled not from fear but from the weight of what she was about to do. The medications would work in sequence. First, a sedative to ensure he wouldn't wake during the process. Then insulin to drop his blood sugar to dangerous levels. Finally, potassium chloride to disrupt his cardiac rhythm, creating an arrhythmia that would appear as sudden cardiac death. Tragic but not impossible for a surgeon who had just completed a marathon procedure under stress. Katerina entered room 14 at 3:12 a.m. She established an 4-line in Ahmed's arm with the practiced efficiency of a nurse who had performed this task thousands of times. He stirred slightly but didn't wake fully, his exhaustion so complete that her movements didn't register as threats. She administered the first injection, the sedative that would keep him unconscious while the other medications did their work. As she depressed the plunger, Ahmed's eyes opened briefly. In that moment, they made eye contact, and she saw his confusion transform into recognition and then terror as he understood what was happening. He tried to speak, to move, but the sedative was already working. His words came out slurred and incoherent. "Kate, what? Stop! You said the system protects people like you?" Katerina whispered, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "Let's see if it can protect you from me." She administered the insulin, then waited the calculated 15 minutes before giving the final injection of potassium chloride. She watched Ahmed's cardiac monitor as his rhythm became erratic, the alarms silenced by her manual override, so that no one would respond until she was ready. The process took 37 minutes from first injection to final cardiac arrest. Katerina sat beside the bed for the entire duration, holding Ahmed's hand the way she had held the hands of dying patients throughout her nursing career. She prayed in Tagalog, asking forgiveness for what she was doing, while simultaneously feeling a cold satisfaction that for once, a predator was facing consequences for his cruelty. At 3:47 a.m., Ahmed's heart stopped beating. Katerina waited 2 minutes to ensure there would be no resuscitation possibility. Then she activated the emergency alarm and began the performance of a nurse discovering a doctor in sudden medical crisis. The response was immediate. Code team members flooded room 14, beginning resuscitation protocols that Katerina knew would be futile. She played her role perfectly. The shocked, caring nurse who had found Dr. Khalil unresponsive, who had immediately activated emergency response, who had no explanation for why a healthy surgeon would suddenly go into cardiac arrest. But Katerina had made one critical miscalculation. The hospital security cameras, recently upgraded to monitor all clinical areas, had recorded her entering room 14 with syringes, had captured the duration of time she spent alone with Ahmed before the emergency alarm was activated, and had documented her manual override of the cardiac monitor alarms. The toxicology report on Ahmed's blood would later reveal the presence of medications that had no legitimate reason to be in his system. The investigation would uncover their affair through the text messages and photographs Katerina had saved. And the security footage would provide visual evidence of what appeared to be premeditated murder rather than tragic medical emergency. Katerina was arrested at 6:15 a.m., still wearing the scrubs stained with Ahmed's blood from the failed resuscitation attempts. She didn't resist or deny her actions. In her exhausted confession given 12 hours later, she described the affair, the pregnancy, the threats, and the desperate calculation that led her to believe murder was her only option for justice. "I'm a healer," she told the investigators, her hands cradling her pregnant belly. "I spent 4 years learning to save lives. But he destroyed mine, and he was going to destroy my baby's life too. The system wouldn't protect me, so I protected myself." The case of Katerina Santos became international news within 48 hours of her arrest. The narrative contained every element that captures public attention. A pregnant nurse, a married doctor, forbidden love, professional exploitation, and murder in a hospital meant to save lives rather than end them. Dubai prosecutors charged Katerina with first-degree premeditated murder, arguing that the evidence showed careful planning, acquired murder weapons, the medications, and deliberate execution. They sought the death penalty, citing the particularly egregious nature of murder committed by a medical professional using tools of healing to kill. Katerina's defense team, funded by the Philippine government and Filipino expat organizations, presented a narrative of extreme emotional disturbance and coercive control. They argued that Ahmed had systematically exploited Katerina's vulnerability, that his threats and abandonment of their child created a psychological crisis that impaired her judgment, and that her actions, while criminal, were the desperate response of someone with no other options for protection or justice. The trial lasted 14 weeks and featured testimony that exposed uncomfortable truths about power dynamics in Dubai's medical industry. 11 other Filipino nurses came forward with stories of exploitation by Ahmed and other doctors. Affairs that had ended with deportation, forced abortions, or quiet terminations justified as performance issues. Betty, Katerina's roommate, testified about the culture of silence around these exploitations, explaining how nurses understood that complaining about powerful doctors meant ending their careers and losing income their families desperately needed. "We accept the abuse because speaking out destroys us," she said through tears. "The system punishes us for being victims." Ahmed's widow, Layla, testified about her husband's character, painting him as a devoted father and talented surgeon whose momentary weakness had been exploited by a calculating woman who trapped him with pregnancy and then killed him when he wouldn't abandon his family. Her testimony was emotionally powerful but undermined by defense presentation of Ahmed's pattern of affairs and the evidence of his threatening behavior toward Katerina. The most devastating testimony came from medical experts who explained exactly how Katerina had killed Ahmed, the specific medications, their interactions, the calculated timing, and the clinical knowledge required to execute such a plan. This testimony reinforced the prosecution's argument that this was premeditated murder by someone who knew exactly what she was doing, not a crime of passion or momentary insanity. Katerina herself testified for 6 hours over 2 days. She admitted administering the fatal medications, acknowledged planning Ahmed's death for several days, and expressed remorse that felt genuine even as she struggled to explain actions she herself barely understood. "I know what I did was wrong," she said, her voice breaking repeatedly. "I took an oath to do no harm, and I violated that oath. But I want people to understand that I didn't start as a murderer. I was destroyed piece by piece until the person who entered room 14 that night wasn't the nurse who came to Dubai to help her family. She was someone who saw no other way out." The verdict, delivered on September 14, 2021, found Katerina guilty of second-degree murder rather than first-degree, acknowledging the extreme emotional distress and coercive circumstances while rejecting claims that her actions were justified. She was sentenced to 25 years in Dubai Central Prison, with the possibility of sentence reduction and deportation after 15 years. The child she was carrying, a daughter she named Amara, meaning eternal in Arabic, was delivered in the prison medical facility in June 2021. Under Philippine law, Amara was placed with Katerina's family in Bacolod, who now care for a child whose father was murdered by her mother, a legacy of trauma that will shape generations. The system that failed to protect Katerina made no meaningful changes after her conviction. Hospitals implemented stronger policies against doctor-nurse relationships, but enforcement remained weak and punishments remained unequal. Foreign nurses continued being exploited, and powerful doctors continued facing minimal consequences. Ahmed's family received 2 million dirhams in blood money compensation from Katerina's supporters, an amount that took 18 months to raise through donations from Filipino communities worldwide. His children grew up knowing their father was murdered, but perhaps never fully understanding why. Subscribe if you believe these stories matter. Share this with someone who needs to understand that behind every headline is a human being pushed beyond endurance. And remember, justice that only works for the powerful isn't justice at all. It's just another form of oppression wearing a judge's robe.